All right. Yay. Uh, hello, ladies and gentlemen. Uh, welcome back to a freaking stream, which I know I haven't done in absolutely forever. But yeah, we back again. Backstreet's back. All right. So I'm here with Ghost of Watts from Twitter. Some of you probably know him. A lot of you probably do. But we're here today to talk about some. My original idea was to talk about right-wing spirituality, but as we talked, it kind of morphed into spirituality in general, which I think is a good idea because I think it's a broader topic, easier to get into. A lot of sub things we can get into, like how politics affects spirituality and all that. But yeah, what you want to introduce yourself, Watts, and give the people a little bit of synopsis about you?
Yeah, I'm a Twitter user, I guess, who occasionally streams. I'm a big fan of Eastern philosophy. I have been for a really long time, at least for me. So I'm 20, so that's like 6 years. So it's like a quarter of my life. um, but yeah, I've been into the spirituality thing since I was like 14 or 15. That's really when I started exploring it, and I started with in-depth Catholic theology, which I'm sure some of you are probably big fans of. And then I moved on to the Eastern stuff, and that's kind of where I've stayed.
Yeah, you told me you were like one of the first books you read was Mere Christianity, right?
Yes, yes, I read Mere Christianity, another book by C.S. Lewis. I'll be honest, I didn't really find C.S. Lewis that convincing.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I don't know if you've seen him at all, but another Twitter denizen, Owen Cyclops, or at Western Identity, who did like the artwork for Batbook and all that. He actually had, I think, he recently did like a little flowcharty type thing with some of his readings, and he actually had Mere Christianity on there, I think. So, what exactly did you find about it that was sort of like, was it just unconvincing, or was something about it off-putting to you?
I mean, C.S. Lewis is a good writer, and there were a lot of interesting arguments in there, but I think he kind of jumped to conclusions and he made a lot of unjustified assumptions that turned me off fairly early on. The one thing that I remember, and I went back and I read some of it like 6 months ago, and I was like, oh yeah, I remember. It was he made the argument that because human beings hold others to an objective moral standard, that must mean that objective moral standard exists. And I think he was assuming that only works if you assume that humans have to be like morally consistent. And as we all know, they're not. So you can hold people to objective standards of whatever you want without that objective standard like existing on its own. Not to say that objective morality can exist, but I think it was just a very poor argument, and that turned me off pretty quickly.
No, sure, I can kind of understand that. I've read very little of Lewis. I think the only book I have by him is the Screw Tape Letters, which a teacher of mine recommended to me. But that's sort of just a little bit of theology. It's like a back and forth between, I think it might be Satan or some other demon, and Screw Tape, which is another demon, and like they're Screw Tape is like the mentee, and he's trying to like gain insight from this other demon about how to keep humans in sin and stuff. So not necessarily like the deeper theological, philosophical stuff. But yeah, if that's the argument he was making, then I would agree with you. It would be a poor one, but I'd have to go back and read that for myself.
Yeah,
but
C.S. Lewis is very like pop Christianity, I think, writer. I think I think he's a good writer if someone just wants to understand what Christianity is generally. He doesn't really go into like specific denomination stuff. So it's good for a broad overview, but not very good for like deeper theological arguments.
Yeah, sure. And now, obviously, if for people who don't know, your name is a reference to the philosopher Alan Watts, who was in a large way, in more recent times, responsible for making Eastern philosophy sort of palatable to the general Western audience. And so, what turned you on to him?
Well, it was I had originally gotten into Eastern philosophy by just reading, it was Tibetan Buddhism originally. Now I'm more of a fan of the Chinese and Japanese Zen Buddhism. But I would just read these texts from these Tibetan Buddhist lamas, and I started the meditation thing, and there was this one where you have to like deconstruct an object in your mind, and it was a weird one, but it's interesting. Like a table doesn't exist on its own. It's reliant on everything else, and you focus on the feeling that you get from that. And I felt like I was being sucked into a black hole, and it was a very scary experience, and I couldn't like turn it off. And it was my first really big like spiritual experience, at least my very first like hugely negative one. And I went online, and it was something like fear of enlightenment. I typed in, and an Alan Watts video popped up, and he just had a very good way of explaining these experiences, and it helped me understand what I was feeling a bit more, because I was freaking out. I was like 14. It was horrifying. I was more scared then than I was the one time I took shrooms. It was a pretty freaky experience, and he just broke down what I was experiencing in a very digestible way. And that's what he does with all of Eastern philosophy. Alan Watts didn't create any ideas of his own. He just translated them into the West, and it's specifically to Americans.
Right, right. Rodin in the chat's asking, have you read I certainly haven't, but I think this is more for you. Have you read the Tibetan Book of the Dead?
I have not yet. I've been eyeballing it at my local bookstore for like the past 2 years, but it's like $60.
Oof.
It's pretty. So I want it, but
No.
I have heard interesting things. I know the author of The Power of Now, or the Be Here Now, which was the Harvard psychologist who like dropped everything and moved to India to be Hindu. He read the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and I know they said that their experiences while on LSD lined up with what was described in that book. So I know that's interesting.
Interesting. Yeah, that sounds pretty cool. I know, a lot of more ancient traditions have taken advantage of psychedelics in order to gain spiritual insight and stuff. And that's certainly something we can talk about. But you said something interesting earlier, and I want to get into that, because you talked about deconstructing the table and things like that, and sort of how it led you down a hole and things like that. So what exactly, and we can sort of shoehorn in a discussion about metaphysics into this, but like what exactly, how did you deconstruct the concept of like the table and come to the conclusion sort of that it really wasn't there without, our perceiving of it?
Yeah, I mean, it was an exercise in identity, which I'm sure we're going to be talking about a ton of. But it was like, if you think about it, the table isn't just one thing. It's just a collection of multiple things of the wood, and how it's shaped and how it contrasts against the background. But even those things aren't a collection on their own. It's something that you're projecting by perceiving it. And this described as emptiness. It's the translation. But Alan Watts said that a better translation would be like relativity, in that it relies on, I think the Buddha said it was like dependent arising. Every little bit is dependent on another, and nothing exists on its own. It's empty of self-existence.
Interesting. So this is a very, I guess you could say, anti-essentialist sort of metaphysic, as in, there are no essential properties to things. Everything is wholly dependent on itself, and so there really is no one sort of center of reference. There is no one frame of reference or objective frame of reference you can kind of go back to when when you're trying to perceive reality. It's wholly experience based. It's wholly phenomenological.
Yeah, yeah, and it's also an important thing to notice. There's also the idea that you are an active participant, and literally creating reality around you by observing it, and that's part of the identity. That's part of the object's existence as well, because while it doesn't exactly disappear when you're not looking at it. It doesn't exist in the same form because it's not being perceived.
Okay, interesting. And so, would you say then then what is the justification for the self existing in some concept? Because we're these beings that, we're the ones doing the perception and thereby creating reality. But how are we creating this reality? Like, how are we how are we the only beings that have this sort of essential property which allows us to construct reality, so to speak?
Well, that's the thing. There is no justification for the self. That's kind of what this the conclusion that the Buddhists come to. Um, but I think the Zen Buddhists have a bit of more interesting perspective. Where when they talk about the self, they mean ego, which is sort of like the little self, which is your ideas about yourself, and your name and how you act, and it's all a construction. But there's this bigger self, Brahman or Tao, which is everything, but it can't be known because it's you. So it's this weird contradictory position where, like, yeah, like the self doesn't exist, it relies on everything else, and because you can construct it down, it doesn't exist on its own, but this whole network of self-dependent things arising and falling, that can be described as like one thing, but they also don't like to describe it as one thing. They say non-duality instead of oneness, and that's an
Mm-hmm.
important distinction in a lot of these texts.
No, it's funny because as you say that to me, I can understand why that'd be confusing to somebody who's sort of like just entering a discussion on, metaphysics and idealism and kind of like that. But as I'm listening to it, and we've talked about how Hegel and German idealism sort of relates to this new Eastern, or not new Eastern, but the older traditions of like Hindu and Buddhist idealism. And it's very interesting as you're talking about non duality versus oneness and like the differences between those things and the contradiction sort of between them, because it relates very much to how Hegel would conceive of reality and the inner contradictions that lie within it to some extent. Now, obviously, that's sort of where Hegel gets this notion of the dialectic, and his idea is sort of like what you would call Brahman, or what you referred to as Brahman before he would refer to as the absolute. And so the point of the dialectic was that each, as we as individuals go through it, or individuals, quote unquote, go through it, and as we as society move through it, we're slowly sort of stepping away from the small self towards the absolute, or Brahman, and the oneness, so to speak. And, conflicts as they come about are resolved and new ones are brought up. And so while it's not, to refer to it in the dialectical sense, you have, thesis and antithesis, and there's always a new one of those coming about. And it's interesting as it relates to the self, because Slavoj Žižek, who's also a pretty big Hegelian, sort of makes this point that in the dialectic, you have the way things existing positing their conditions before they exist. So in some event, there's, you and yourself after your birth. But without the event of your birth, there could, no, using a bad example, like the bracelet that was once lost that is now found. Well, it couldn't have been the bracelet that was once lost if it hadn't been lost in the first place. And so that event inherently changes the identity of the object you're talking about completely going forward. And so that object couldn't have possibly existed with that specific identity without that event. And so you needed that event to form the identity, but it didn't happen yet. And so it gets weird like that to some extent.
Oh yeah, and I think an important thing to remember when talking about these weird metaphysics, because metaphysics is weird. Um, a lot of stuff it's first of all, a lot of it's intuitive.
Mm-hmm.
It's not really an empirical thing. It can't be, because it takes the subjective into account, and then subjective and objective get mixed in metaphysics. But the most important thing to remember, I think, is that and having difficulty describing these things and having all these contradictions, that's not necessarily a reflection on like the truthfulness about what we're talking about. I think it's a reflection on the limitations of language. It's a limitation of language, not reality. When
No,
you're talking about all these things.
yeah, no, that's a good point. Because oftentimes you get things like the bachelor's paradox, or edgy fedora tip atheists who try to like one up you when it comes to like the logical consistency of gods. Like, oh, can God make a married bachelor? And if you ask me, I would just say the answer is yes, but for different reasons. Because obviously we know, a married bachelor is an impossible thing, but it's not impossible because it's some sort of, real thing that if it were to exist, like, the universe were to just implode or something, it can't exist because we've simply set up the definitions of words to make it so that it can't exist. It's not
It's
like it's a
it's just a
lack of a
construct.
substantial thing.
It's just a construct.
Yeah. And it's a construct. More importantly, constructs can describe real things, like, to reference Western identity, or Owen Cyclops again, because I like the example he gave. Mammal, quote unquote, or like the concept of mammal is a social construct, but it describes a real thing. It describes a real category. But the married, and you could say married describes something real, and bachelor describes something real. And but married bachelor is something that we could change the meanings of the words so that they could describe something different, and all of a sudden it wouldn't be a contradiction. Like the
Whenever you
state.
have to talk about anything, you have to distance yourself from like tangible reality, because it's all an abstraction, which is fine because that's how we communicate. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but it's fine because that's how we communicate or whatever. But people get confused. They confuse the ideas about reality with tangible reality itself, and tangible reality itself just can't be explained. It's an experience. At least that's my position.
Yeah,
Um,
I think there's something to that. And I mean, to your point, you need to have. I spoke with. I used to speak with an objectivist friend of mine a little bit more, and he would always tell me that it's metaphysics that has to inform your epistemology and not the other way around, which is a weird thing to think about as you're kind of going through it in your head, because epistemology is like the system of knowing things, to put it very broadly. And so how can you know metaphysics if you don't even have a system of knowing things to begin with? But you need, that system of, you need to let what is real first sort of inform you before you can decide if you even know what is real to some extent. And you need to let the real sort of seep in, and you need to get that experience before you can say, well, all right, this is real, this isn't. A little bit of a system of trial and error, somewhat.
yeah, it's a little more intuitive, like I said before. It's not a science. Uh, and it's complicated and it's difficult. Like I've spent it took me a long time to really soak in a lot of these Eastern concepts. I spent a couple of years like reading about it. Um, and then I started like experiencing it and then really, really getting it. Uh, but I think that's why people like Watts are so brilliant, because they're able to not articulate it, but gesture towards it.
Mm-hmm. Now, what does that mean then in terms of the self? Because a lot of times you have sort of this free will debate going on, and normally it's not done in good faith. It's done by people with a position like, Sam Harris, who has an entrenched position. I don't. Have you ever read his little, book / pamphlet, Free Will?
I've not, but I heard him debate Ben Shapiro about it, so I think I
Oh
understand his
God.
position pretty well.
Yeah, that Sam Harris Ben Shapiro debate sounds like something you have to listen to for eternity on the seventh circle of hell. But
Oh no.
uh, but I mean, it's I happened to read it because I wanted to discuss it with some people, and it's Nick Fuentes clip says Sam Harris is autistic, and he is, but for different reasons than someone like Ben Shapiro might be, or than say an Alan Watts might be, or something like that. He comes at things with this, he's very sure he knows what's real. Like, he is more sure than any philosopher or any scientist has ever been in the past. And that's a problem. That's a huge problem with pop philosophy and science, is that everybody thinks that they know the truth, for 100% sure. And, we all do to some extent. I think I have a reasonable grasp on the truth, but I'm willing to make concessions. Sam Harris is like an immovable intellectual object, so to speak, in that he's just too damn stubborn for his own good. And
That's what made the debate so great, because it was Ben Shapiro and Sam Harris, who are both
yeah,
immovable. stubborn
Yeah.
objects, but in opposite directions. So it was like an immovable object meets an unstoppable force, and it was just it was kind of a train wreck.
Yeah, I'm sure it was. But like one of the big things, he does in his little pamphlet, Free Will, is he talks about, he has this idea in his mind that the popular position on free will is the libertarian notion. And this, of course, has nothing to do with the political philosophy. It's this notion, the libertarian notion of free will is that, you are completely free to make all your own choices. You're not influenced by anything biological in nature. And like the only other option is, determinism, which is what he endorses essentially in his book and tries to make the case for. Determinism is kind of played down as this, oh, it's like the puppet accepting its strings and things like that, which is, it's debates not often had in good faith, but it is still a debate worth having, because the question of do we have free will versus do we not have free will is one that is important, because not only does it inform how you live your life, but how we go about forming laws on punishment. Crime and punishment is always a big thing that comes up with this kind of thing.
Exactly. It
How
that's just what I was thinking. It informs on how we hold people responsible. I know I was
hmm,
streaming with Mouthy Buddha at some point last year, and we were talking about free will. And he's like, "Yeah, but if you just," he goes, "It when you do the same Harris thing and accept that free will doesn't exist, you have like more sympathy for people who are like doing bad things because they like can't help it." I remember thinking, "That's I don't know about that, man. That makes me nervous."
yeah, well, that's the thing. He tries to like save his conception of determinism from like fatalism and like this, oh well, they can't help themselves, and how do we know, like there's a whole bunch of problems wrought with his sort of materialist deterministic worldview, the least of which is the fact that you literally can't have a conception of right and wrong that way, because if everything's predetermined, then we're predetermined to believe things that we think are true. We can have no actual way of knowing whether or not they're true. But besides that, I wanted to get into your um, idea of, or the Eastern idea, so to speak, of free will and such versus determinism and something like that, or the view that is endorsed by Eastern philosophy, because I've heard a couple things from a couple different sources, be it Zizek and some other people like Mouthy Buddha. But I want to hear exactly what is your take what is the Eastern take on free will as you understand it?
As I understand it, the one that I'm most familiar with, the Zen Buddhism, that's not really something they talk about. And I think it's because they just think it's not an important question.
Really?
Yeah, and I agree with them to a certain extent because there's an underlying question behind free will that you need to answer before you can answer anything about free will. Is you need to try to understand what the self is and how it works before you can try and understand if it has its own free will and can make its own choices or whatever, anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the idea is once you understand the self and get to that point, it doesn't really matter after that.
That's
That's my interpretation, at least. I'm definitely by no means an expert, and I think Tibetans are a lot more intellectual. Like they have like academic essays about it,
mm.
whereas the Zen Buddhists are like a lot more free form, intuitive, poetic. So there might be a lot of contention there, but this is as far as I understand it in the Zen sphere.
Okay. So then, what is the now? Is this focus on the self based out of like, if you just focus on the self and achieve Brahman, or no, you don't achieve Brahman, you would achieve Nirvana and you'd become one with Brahman, I suppose would be the correct terminology. But would that sort of just like at that point, does it not matter because you've already, you've become something greater at that point, and so once you're united with Brahman, the absolute, etc., etc., free will just becomes irrelevant, or is it because the journey itself, the steps you take, it really wouldn't matter if they're predetermined or not, or if you chose them or not, because eventually we're all just going to get to the same place anyway.
Hmm. See, I don't know if I can answer that just because I've never read any literature on it from this, and I haven't even found any in my reading.
Interesting.
So yeah, I think, and I think it's just the absence of the literature, which is why I'm trying to guess and see what they're at. But yeah, I think that most of them wouldn't think that it's all that super important.
Yeah, that's interesting, because the way I would look at it is, I can't say necessarily that Hegel has a position on this either. He was, in some sense, a determinist, but the way I sort of rectify, the liking the dialectic and the dialectic of history somewhat, and my Catholicism, which requires a dualist metaphysics. So you're not a materialist, you're not an idealist, but you're you're both at the same time. Is that I often like to think that what you get out of when you apply the dialectical method to a dualist metaphysic, is you get something that works nicer, in my opinion, because we on Earth, our goal is to be with Logos, God, or you could call him the absolute if you want, which Hegel kind of does. He was a Lutheran, and so he did believe in God to some extent, but his conception of it was sort of changed by his philosophy and as he was building it. But with that in mind, being that we all try to strive to be with God, and then on Earth, obviously we can't, and so it's a struggle of constantly getting better and better at being in union with him and having a relationship with him, until eventually we die, and eventually that's how we unify him, after the purification of our soul. That's sort of like the last dialectical phase we can go through on Earth. But in general, I think humanity can, as a whole, because all of us are individuals, whether we realize it or not, are trying to be with God. You could also say we as humanity, in some sense, are getting closer and closer as time goes on, to some extent, or in some ways, depending on the method and things like that. And so you have a way of rectifying this sort of unification of, we're trying to be one with Brahman. We're all trying to reach nirvana, whatever that is for each of us. But at the same time, we're still real here. There still is an essential us. There's still an essential table, so to speak. But eventually there won't be. And we're trying to make it so that we're getting to the point where we're ready for when there won't be. Because, that's the second coming of Christ, when the world ends. And essentially at that point, we're all just the world of forms eventually.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's probably where we'd start to disagree, because I would definitely not describe myself as an essentialist.
Yeah, I figured. Well, what is your so as you sort of deconstruct things, and as there's no basis for the self, how can you even begin to sort of know? This is another thing. I think it's sort of idealism and materialism sort of share some similar problems, but in opposite extremes. And so, in the same way that the materialist can't know truth, really, how do you get to knowing the absolute or Brahman, if really we're just if we're just not even really here? How do we get to know Brahman, or how can we even know that Brahman exists?
I don't think it's that we're not here. I think it's that how we perceive ourselves is incorrect, because the word emptiness is used a lot, but like I said before, Watts had a good interpretation, which was relativity. So we have this idea that we are this independent being that is facing the world, like we came into this world as if we came from somewhere else and we're separate from it. When really we're just a small part of this vast network of all of these moving parts that everything is reliant on something else. So we're here, but not in the way we usually assume we are. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, no, I would say it makes some sense. I would say, I run into a similar interpretation with Hegel, of course, because he's a very big believer in that sort of same wholeness. The big thing, the big leap forward from Kant to him, was Kant was big on saying we can never really know the universe because our reason is this imperfect thing that we can't use to really perceive the universe accurately. And so, that was his big justification for saying, you can't really rely on the senses to some extent. And so, you have to use reason. He was a big rationalist. But at the same time, what Hegel told Kant was that, to put it in very Zizekian terms, no, fuck you. Our reason is no less a part of reality than everything else that's a part of reality. And so we're no more separate, and our faculties are no more separate from this universe than the things you're claiming are. Like, the thing in itself is no less a part of reality than the reason you're using to perceive the thing in itself. And so Hegel was very much agreeing with that same sort of wholeness. And to some extent, I do too. What I would say, though, is that while we're all a part of this same whole, there's different categories within it. To be very platonic about it, there are different forms, and they're distinguishable things with essential parts to some extent. Now, they're no less a part of the essential reality, but to put it in math terms, it would be like having, you have the universal set, which is literally everything, and then you have subsets. You have aleph null, or aleph, which is, the infinite sequence of all integers, which is a subset of everything, which is truly infinite everything. And then you have something like the set of all infinitesimals and things like that. So you have things which are equally a part of this whole and this everything, but they still have distinct and finite categories, because they aren't actuality. It's themselves. They are just being. They are finite, whereas actuality is infinite.
Mm. Yeah, I think there's some. I definitely think there's some truth to that, and we can come to some agreement on that, because I don't. I think things can be. I guess I could word it like, I think things can be essential, not in form but in action.
Hmm.
Like, for example, I do not walk around in my day-to-day life as this formless uh, being who is part of the bigger whole, the Tao, the Brahman. Um, I'm just kind of living life normally, and I have name, I have hobbies, and that's how I view myself, because it's useful. And I act as if I am essential, and I act as if other people are essential. When I talk to other people, I don't do these deconstructive uh, exercises, because that's not how we're wired to interact with people. Because our subjective experience, I think, our subjective experience makes things essential. It's what puts that table together, and
Mm-hmm.
recognizes its form in contrast to the background, and and puts that all together. And that's what I was talking about earlier with how we're creating the universe, not just by physically perceiving it, but also kind of taking this blob of atoms and molecules and perceiving them as distinct forms, which are in action essential.
Yeah. Now, if I may poke you a bit, that would, to some extent, that sort of giving into the subjective interpretation and acting as if things are essential. That's somewhat a betrayal of, the Eastern philosophy itself, isn't it? Because aren't you supposed to, like, sort of project that mindset entirely if you want to actually achieve Brahman and such?
I mean, it could be. It really depends on which part of Eastern philosophy. I think Tibetans would probably beg to differ on me with that, and maybe even some Zen Buddhists would. But the way I practice is that sort of I base everything, all my metaphysics, around uh, experience. Everything stems from that, and that's how humans experience the world.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because one of the things that, if you listen to a couple of Zizek lectures, and I've listened to a bunch now, admittedly, because when I'm driving in the car, I don't like music. I usually like to try to keep the synapses firing and such. So I listen to him and try to decipher through like the thick Slovenian lisp what he's actually saying. But one of the things he talks about is this book called Zen at War, and it talks about how the Buddhists in Japan were advising, the imperial Japanese army, and how the Nazis, through sort of German idealism, adopted a similar view that because they weren't really there, like, they sort of had this view, a similar metaphysic almost, that, they weren't really there. They are just, the things they experience as phenomenology are just a lie, and their greater spirit, they're just a part of Brahman that's misguided to some extent, and so in that way they were able to separate themselves from the atrocities they were committing in order to keep sane as they were doing them. And like that's how the Buddhists felt justified in uh helping the Japanese war machine and the atrocities they were committing, because they were just fellow travelers. They weren't really them. It wasn't really them committing these atrocities. It's just this mere flesh form that we perceive. And so that's some of the, and it speaks to almost sort of, now Zizek doesn't buy into that, of course, but it does speak to, or almost sort of this radical, I guess, libertarian free will position that he believes exists in Buddhism and in Eastern philosophy in general. Now, I don't know if that's accurate, but what would you kind of say to that, like using Buddhism and its metaphysic in that way to sort of justify atrocities like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can take about anything that matters to people, especially something like spirituality, and weaponize it by like adding a few tweaks. I do remember you mentioning this book to me, The Zen at War,
Mm,
and I remember doing research about it a while ago because I used to be a religion major at when I went to State University. And there was some controversy, not controversy, but there are a lot of criticisms of the book and how it misinterprets DT Suzuki specifically, and how it portrays him as this kind of like militant uh, religious guy who wanted to push Japan into this far right nationalist camp, and he wasn't really like that. And I've only read a couple essays and a book by Suzuki, um, but I think there's a decent chance that the book was misinterpreting what he was laying down. He was kind of a hippie too, like he he had a couple passages where he was clear he didn't like militarism in general. That was something that Buddhism, I think, was trying to get away from.
mm-hmm.
I think it was I forget the name, but it was a certain regime from a while ago that they were still trying to move away from. And he was even fond of socialism to a certain extent.
Right, right. I guess the larger question I have, though, is it's quite possible that Zizek was misinterpreting Suzuki. I think he does sort of, whether he realizes it or not, I think he does sort of unconscious psychoanalysis on a lot of people. And I think that
Mm,
informs his opinions on their beliefs, and it informs his opinions of what those beliefs actually are to some extent. But my other question would then also be, you know, as a Buddhist, how would you argue against this idea of, we're not really here. This flesh body that we're experiencing isn't really us. Therefore, whatever atrocities I commit can't really be laying at my feet. And so, you can't really blame me for anything. How would you sort of argue against that? Even if it is like, a misinterpretation, what would you say to sort
right.
of clarify the point?
Uh, I'm not really a Buddhist, but in my interpretations,
Right. Sorry.
um,
Just Eastern in general.
no, yeah, no, yeah, you're fine. But I would say you would kind of have to resist a lot of natural human impulses and get your mind in a weird place in order to, because really all that line of thinking is a way of distancing yourself from what you're doing morally, right? And how
Hmm.
you feel about it. And I think that betrays just how our subjective experience usually is. I think we know that, like, because like I said before, things can be essential in action. And in order to get away from that, you kind of have to think yourself in through all these loops. Does that make any sense?
I think I get what you're saying, but now what would be like, as a Christian, I could kind of say, you're not just spirit, because I got my dualist metaphysic. I got, you're not just spirit, you are still the flesh and bones that you are. You're not just some being that's, wanting to be with God who isn't with God at the moment. So, you can get away with all this stuff, respect for other human life, things like that. I can kind of say all those things and be like, no, you're dumb that you can't use this to justify the atrocities you're committing. What
Right.
exactly would you say, like, could you even kind of morally? Well, I mean, I know you could, but it's like, what would be like the Eastern condemnation of like atrocities like that?
Well, I know the Eastern one is practicing compassion is a big part of spiritual practice in general, and it has been every Buddhist tradition it is, and it's from my understanding, it's believed that the less compassionate you are, the further you move away from enlightenment and nirvana. Because if you accept that life is like frustration or dukkha or suffering, there's a couple different translations. It's pretty messed up to make it worse for other people.
So it'd be sort of like from almost an individualist perspective that if you're moving yourself away from enlightenment, that's bad for you, so don't do other bad things.
Kind of, yeah. I know just in Buddhism in general, compassion is one of the most important practices in order to achieve enlightenment. I'm not actually, I haven't thought about that in a long time. I'm not sure what the actual justification for it is. If it is this like Ayn Rand esque, well, it helps me. So thing, I think maybe on paper it looks like that, but on practice it probably isn't. Uh, how I would deal with that, I don't. I'll be honest. I don't really. I've been working for a long time to figure out like this cohesive moral system, and I've yet to come up with a lot of results. So I don't know how I could justify it objectively, but I know it's wrong because it's another person that is, like you said, they're flesh. You don't get to decide for them if they want to go be with God right now. Um, and because I think that deconstructivism is interesting and it's useful, but if you dwell on it too much, it can allow you to do weird things. That's probably like I talked about in my experience before. That freaked me out.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like almost it's not quite like the Cartesian deconstruction that Descartes does as he's going through, all these things to get to the cogito ergo sum. But it's also not quite like the whole postmodern situation where it's like deconstructing grand narratives and things like that in order to, say, nobody's a universalist. You can't justify morality this way, and so forth and so on. But it was, that's sort of the thing about deconstruction. You run into a point where eventually you're just left with nothing because you could potentially deconstruct everything. Although I do think you eventually run into a wall at which you can and can't deconstruct. I think it stops at some point, and at that terminus, you
Mm-hmm.
find some base for being and some base for the justification for a lot of beliefs in metaphysics that the church in particular has held. But of course, somebody else could find a different base and find it's the core for a different metaphysical construction of reality. I'm under no illusions that mine is specifically the right one, although I'm willing to hedge my bets on it.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's one of the reasons why I drifted more towards the Zen ideas of direct experience and Zen. I've based a lot of what I've had around direct experience and intuition instead of trying to think myself in all these loopholes about well, is that person really a person, or should I even care? Because I was like that for a bit, and I was freaky. Couldn't really argue against it. But after getting into some more mindfulness meditations and diving firsthand into everyday experience, I've learned to develop my gut feeling and intuition with that, which is, I think, what a lot of morality boils down to, which is why it's so hard to come up with a cohesive moral system. Does that make any
Yeah.
sense? I'm sorry. I'm much better with writing. I'm bad
No,
at thinking on the spot.
no, same. I agree with you. A lot of it is sort of gut feelings to some extent. I think though there's not, the problem with gut feeling in another sense is that it lends itself very heavily to, like, the Sam Harris types, because, you say gut feeling, and Sam Harris immediately hears some sort of like unconscious reaction in the brain firing, and he's like, oh, morality is really just this reaction going on in your mind, and yada yada yada. And I don't deny that morality has evolutionary benefits, and we've probably evolved certain behaviors we consider moral because they've been good survival tactics. But at the same time, I don't believe, well, kind of 2 points almost. In some extent, because of my pre-held beliefs, I believe that we have a creator who set up the world so that we have a system which, morality is rewarded by survival. I think that I wouldn't put that past, a god to have designed into our universe. I think that would actually make a lot of sense. But on top of that, I would also say that, the things we consider moral did have to be discovered somewhat. And I'm not just talking about revelation, I'm talking about through the works of, you know, my big guys would be Aristotle, Plato, Platonius, who was a Neoplatonist, Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine, those guys in general, the church fathers and the ancient Greeks. And, we've had to come to an understanding through not just experience, but through building on that experience in order to get a really solid foundation for morality where it aligns, not only does it align with our gut feeling, but more importantly, it can be justified fairly well. And I think one of the things we've lost with deconstruction is some of that, not the justification for it. The justifications are still the justifications, but we've lost the ability to tell ourselves, this is actually justifiable. And we're now just in the habit of saying, oh, well, this isn't really justifiable. This is just, this is just your opinion, man. And
Right. Yeah, I think humans hold a lot of most humans hold a contradictory position where uh it was like C.S. Lewis's point that I talked about before. They hold people to objective standards, even if they don't believe in those objective standards, at least consciously. So I think in a weird way, humans are wired to, even if they don't have like a objective moral system, they're going to hold them to a standard
oh yeah,
objectively that isn't even really uh, justified metaphysically. Sometimes they're just holding it to them, and I haven't really decided if that means if it's because there's an objective moral standard, or if it's just if it's just a useful way for humans to organize to hold each other accountable.
yeah. Well, I think like kind of like I said before, you have the case for saying it's both to some extent, but I think you could say that it's probably like nobody's really a relativist, at least morally speaking, I believe, because at the end of the day, we all have those gut feelings, and whether or not we say, morality is relative, what's good in this situation isn't good in the other, therefore, it's all relative. Nobody's going to sit here and tell me that, you know, I shoot your, in no situation is, you know, shooting somebody's grandma for no apparent reason, for like absolutely no reason. In no universe is somebody going to say, me just walking up to some nice, sweet old lady who's done nothing wrong and shooting her in the head. That's a bad thing universally. There's some
Right.
that it's a universal. No, everybody says, if you're going to shoot somebody, you should do so with reason. Either they're a threat or they're, I don't know. depending on how you play like the baby Hitler game, like do you kill baby Hitler or not, depending on what you think about that whole question. But nobody says like innocents should just be shot outright in the face for no apparent reason. Like that's not, we've everybody sort of has that universal, no matter how relativistic they claim to be. And so I do think that speaks, I don't believe like we have morality ingrained on us necessarily, like it's been written deep within our moral fiber somewhere, but I'm also not a tabula rasa guy. So I imagine it lies somewhere in between those two. But you were saying?
Yeah, I think a lot of basic moral things are pretty universal across human cultures. Stuff like that, don't kill innocents for no reason, and that's why uh, dictators or anyone who have committed any kind of atrocities have had to back it up with justification, so
Mm.
people could think themselves into that, sort of like what the Zen Buddhists did with the in World War II.
Yeah, everybody needs some sort of, everybody's appealing to something higher at the end of the day, which, Jordan Peterson would say is like effectively their God. And I wouldn't, from a psychological standpoint, I wouldn't disagree with him on that. When he starts to make the claim philosophically about what God is, it gets a bit hazier there, especially for him. But in general, we all do have a God, you know, practically speaking, one way or the other, because we all have something we appeal to, whether it's science or reason or economics, something like that. Like, economics is the God of the libertarian, I would say, probably.
Yeah, I think that's right, because that's something that I noticed even in uh, a completely godless religion like Buddhism. They've over the years, and it varies between denominations, but they've propped them up quite a bit. I know the Dalai Lama in his book describes how he and other Tibetan Buddhists pray to the Buddha before they eat and stuff. And they, bow before a statue and stuff, and they won't say it's worship, and they'll say he was a good human teacher, but or some sects will define it like that. And the Tibetan Buddhists, they have this weird justification. I think it's like he did so much good that he embedded himself into the spirit of karma, and he's just existing everywhere. But it almost seems like all of these religions keep coming back to this worship of something, or even just aligning yourself to a higher ideal.
Yeah, I think we're kind of, I think that's been a consistent pattern. Like, Sam Harris paints religions with too broad a brush, of course, but if you're willing to engage in like good faith and honest sort of criticism of religion or analysis of religion, perhaps you can definitely identify, a lot of similarities between religions and things like that. And, the better religions are those like the people who are honest about what they're saying and what they believe. Like, all the theistic religions are those who are open about what they worship, whereas, you know, different creeds, excuse me, be they philosophical or something like that, are less honest about what specifically they're appealing to. Like, I was in a conversation recently with Shane Killian and some other guys regarding like libertarianism in the NAP, and I kept trying to pin down exactly, what's your justification for the NAP? Why does self ownership mean that I shouldn't violate your self ownership? Well, how do we, you say this is logically consistent, but why are you appealing to logical consistency? What's your base for that? And, they couldn't really answer, because it's like, saying, you know, why follow God? To some extent, the answer is because, he's God. And I know that's sort of selling it short, because I'm sure there's a better answer to it. I just don't know it. But for them, that was where the buck stopped for them. It was like, logic and non-contradiction, which is really just this Kant and Kant fetishism to some extent.
Kant's a
But
faggot.
he is.
He's a nerd. He's a major nerd.
Yes, Kant is the big gay RT.
There's always going to be contradictions in any system, because any ideological system is a extreme oversimplification of reality,
mm,
which is fine, right? That's just how humans operate. and it's done us a lot of good.
Yeah.
But like I said before, a lot of these contradictions are not limitations of reality or limitations of how the world actually functions or limitations of how humans should function, but limitations of language and its ability to describe it. It's like uh, it's difficult to describe metaphysics, and a lot of these moral questions are articulately, or a lot of the base things, like why are you appealing to logic? Why is that
Yeah.
important? Why is it, like, what's your logic behind appealing to the logic? It's difficult, if not impossible, to articulate those, because those are the base for your thinking. It's like trying to bite your own teeth, right? You
Mm.
can't get at the foundation to do the action that the foundation is allowing you to do, right?
Yeah, and that's like a big thing with people who really buy into scientism and things like that, like people like the Sam Harris and the New Atheist types, because they smuggle in all these assumptions about reality and what is that, require justification to some extent themselves in order to be able to say, all right, well, this is truth. This is how we can know truth, and this is how science accurately represents truth, and things like that. And I've tried to have that conversation. I go on, I talk to the guys from the Non Sequitur show every now and again, and I try to get at them with that. Like, what is your basis for knowing these things? If we're all, if everything is predetermined and things like that, like, how do we know we're not just determined to believe in this and it's what we believe because it's practical, but not really the truth? Like the truth could be, we're actions set in motion by the Big Bang, yada yada yada, have led us to see atoms in our electron microscopes, but that might not mean they're actually there, and things like that. But in like the other breath, to reference Zizek again, Zizek has said that he's a believer that there will always be wars to some extent, and his justification for it was being that we have the universals and like the things that we sort of know are out there, these categories, and they're always going to reassert themselves over the particulars because there's always that friction between the two. Like, there's no such thing as a perfect circle. Even though we have the form of the perfect circle in our mind's eye, so to speak. And we have to, obviously we're not going to war over the perfect circle, but things like that, concepts like justice and the good life and freedom and things like that will always breed conflict because what we have on earth is never going to be the perfect version of what we envision it to be, not simply because we all have different ideas of it, but because the forms of those things are just inescapable from us. Those forms are actuality, and again, we are being, so it's two separate categories.
Right. Yeah. But I do think it is important to have conceptions of freedom and justice and all that. So you're working in a direction towards those
Oh
things.
yeah, yeah, of
Even if
course,
you
of
never hit
course.
the bulls. I had a mentor of mine said something like, aim for the bullseye, aim to be perfect at everything you do. And you'll never get there, but you can get closer, like exponentially forever get closer. Uh, so yeah, it's definitely important to hold on to those. I wanted to ask you something though, because it's probably something we should have talked about at the beginning of the stream. How do you define
Sure.
spirituality?
That's a decent question. I suppose I would say spirituality is the act of trying to tune yourself into, you know, I'll try to define it in terms of like a secular context, so to speak, just for the sake of analysis here. But I don't think you can separate spirituality from religion. But if
Mm.
you were to try to do it in sort of that, hippie new age cat mom kind of way, you
Ouch.
well, I mean, not the way you're doing it.
No,
You're
I
doing it,
see what you mean.
yeah, like you're doing a serious inquiry into things. Like most chicks just do yoga and light some incense in their apartment and say
I've
they
met so many
meditate.
weird people at a Buddhist temple that I visit sometimes. So many weird people. I hate the New Age movement. They're awful.
No, I mean, yeah, friggin'. But the way I would try to put it as secularly as possible is spirituality is trying to tune yourself into the transcendentals, trying to tune yourself into something transcendent so that you can I guess I'd put it like, so you can feel the world of forms in order to like gain calm in your life, to sort of know that, you're a speck in an ocean of things, on like, an infinite sea, yada, 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 things like that. But I would say, the point of spirituality is you know, to find peace at the end of the day. You might not get peace immediately, but the end goal is life, finding peace in your life by putting it in focus of the larger picture.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's a fairly decent definition. I think the most concise one I've been able to think of has been the act and the journey of trying to rise above the mundane.
That's a good one too.
And that can be in the form of like a lot of an extreme form of that is like trying to come in contact with like literal supernatural things,
Mm-hmm.
and like otherworldly things. But a much more subtler one, and a bit more grounded, uh, is just it's really introspection.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and like we talked about before, finding that higher principle. But I'm in that place, weird place with my metaphysics where everything is a higher principle and you're already the higher principle, but you're already aligned to it and you don't know it, but you know it and you're still yourself. But it's
yeah.
not the ego that you're trying to look past. It's the you that is your ego and is also the you that grows your fingernails and that creates light when you observe it, and a bunch of weird bullshit.
Yeah, well, that you're trying to live out like a proper idealist metaphysic, which is exactly, as you described it and stuff. Like you are the ideal and so forth, which is, that's a very good description of it. Now, there's one. I have one sort of off-topic question before we get into like political applications of all this, because I think that's sort of where this is going. But have you ever heard of the YouTube channel called Spirit Science?
Oh my god, I fucking hate that guy. If I went to high school with him, I would have bullied him so hard. I've watched his videos, and I definitely have limitations in my understanding of Eastern stuff. I don't speak any of the languages, but I try my best. But there, I disagree with some things, and I try to represent it as best I can because I have a deep respect for this culture. And he is the epitome of commodifying it. And then he just throws in some Taoist imagery. He doesn't know what Taoism is. He doesn't know what it means. And he's like mixing in like Hermetics with Buddhism. Do you know what Hermetics is?
Very loosely, like not really, but I
It's
is that like the
I
stuff with the rocks and stuff and like the plant life and whatever, or
Probably. There was this guy, I forget his name. There's a book, Introduction to Hermetics, that I've been wanting to read for a while. Um, but it's loosely based on like ancient Egyptian meditation, or claims to be at least.
oh,
Um,
okay, yeah,
and
no, I know what you're talking about then.
yeah, and he mixes in like Hermetic stuff and like it's just I can't stand him. We could do a whole stream about how much I hate that faggot. I don't like him. I'm sorry. I don't want to get auto ID'd and have the stream taken down. Man,
No,
he
it's
makes me angry.
I've already had one of my videos put into limited state. I'm not worried about a few more.
Oh, jeez. Oh no.
No, it wasn't even friggin'. It wasn't even a video. Whatchamacallit, that I did with anybody else. It was literally just me. But it's an unimportant video, and I don't care that it was put into limited state.
Oh well.
But yeah, like rip anyway. But
Have you watched it? Have you watched Spirit Science much?
I used to be like, I was very into. I'm still trying to very much gain a grasp on, other ideologies, so to speak, because, whether it's a know thy enemy kind of thing or some of it generally fascinates me, I want to know about it. And spirit science generally sort of fascinated me because it seemed, I don't know, it almost seemed scientific in a sense, not just because like pseudoscience and whatever, but it's like the stuff about souls being things that resonate on sort of different frequencies, quote unquote. And it's like when you die, you go to another frequency and things like that. And it's like, that kind of gelled with my math brain a bit because it's sort of like the higher dimensions in math. Like, we can't represent like, and I'm not just like talking time and stuff here, but it's like when you get into like the high, you can essentially have an infinite number of dimensions in math and things like that. Like, you know,
Depth.
when they say the nth dimension, things like that, that's a real thing. We can't represent it, obviously, because we can only design in like the fourth dimension, or not the fourth dimension, the third dimension. But that sort of resonated with me in that same aspect. It's like, oh, this is kind of like taking from a little bit of particle physics and a little bit of this and that and all this
It
other
just
stuff
takes
about
from
like,
whatever.
yeah,
What
and all this
it's
stuff about like creation
whatever.
energy and chakras. It seemed cool and interesting to me at the time. But,
Did you
you
see
know,
the part where Jews were aliens that failed their spiritual thing, so they had to get sent back in time to Earth, and now that's why they're here?
and it's like, yeah, it's like the Hebrews and like the Martians were a part of it too. And it's like he mentions like he brings up like the Martians as like this big, powerful, like the Martians were like evil. They too were a people that failed their spirituality, and so they had to create this synthetic thing and escape to Earth. And now they're all these big, powerful families, like the Rothschilds, and like they own the central banks and stuff. It's like, wait, I thought the Jews were their own people, and it's like,
He just takes from whatever. I can't stand him.
well, what
Please,
is your?
if you want to, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna ask, like, the one thing that kind of stuck with me a little bit. I mean, I like shiny stuff anyway because lizard brain, and so I like the stuff with the crystals and stuff. But what is your opinion on that? Like the crystal energies aligning with chakras, that
It's
whole
degenerate. Stay
it's
away from it. It's
it's
all
degenerate.
degeneracy. It's degeneracy. Stay away from it. Do
Wow.
wholesome mindfulness meditation. That stuff is garbage, and it's I found no use in it. And if someone can maybe convince me that they're useful, go ahead. I'll be open to it. I don't know. I don't really think much about like supernatural stuff like that, but I found no justification for it, and it. I'm sorry, I'm having such a strong reaction, but it's like it's commodifying uh, a culture and ideas that I hold dearly and I respect greatly, and it's like simplifying them down into like, oh yeah, there's these slant-eyed people that got cool rocks, and there's these chakra things. You watch Dragon Ball Z, right? It's kind of like that. Um, but my approach to spirituality is, I think, a lot simpler than that in the practice, which is just I do a form of meditation, Zen meditation called Shikantaza, where you sit down and you don't concentrate on anything in particular, but you're concentrating, or it's worded like you're concentrating on sitting. It's a very weird meditation to do, and it's difficult, but that's the most useful. But yeah, mindfulness. You don't
Hmm.
need any of the
Don't need the rocks.
no, it's snake oil salesman stuff. And like you said, it's like, wine moms. Get some box wine and some magic rocks. That'll make the divorce go easier on the kids or something.
Wow.
Like,
Wow.
there's a
I
lot
just
of
said
picture
cat.
out here. Sorry.
I just said cat moms in apartments. You're cutting deep, man. Wow.
I've cut deep. Well, I've met these people too, and they're exactly like I thought they would be. It's very shallow, and it's irritating. And I understand the left's like screeching about cultural appropriation sometimes, because this is really what I'm complaining about. I don't mind appropriation, but it's like appropriation that is disrespectful and poor and useless to just sell stuff. That was sort of the downside of the Eastern stuff coming to the West, and this big capitalist society, is it inevitably became a commodity. And a lot of
Yeah.
people have a conception of it that's not really
Mhm.
what it is.
Yeah. No, that I'm sure. And so I guess that kind of you kind of mentioned it with like the left's appeal to cat cat moms and stuff like that, because they're certainly that the demographic that was at the march for our not the march for our lives. What was it in DC with the stupid hats?
The Pussy Hats, that was the Women's March, wasn't
The
it?
women's march. Yeah, yeah. Uh, as my as my mom briefly walks by and speaks with disgust about them as well. uh,
Oh,
based in Red Pilled. Based in Red Pilled.
based mom.
No, but I guess so. that's the thing. You more so than, the left has sort of co-opted certain brands of like Protestant Christianity and who have gone into like all sorts of weird hoops to jump through about like, God and transgenderism or God and like women priests and LGBTQ priests.
Queertheology.com.
Yeah, like all that
Jesus
stuff.
Slut. I watched that video, that queer theologist who was like, yeah, Jesus was a polyamorous slut or anything. I was like, man, if I was like 13 when I was like a neo-reactionary Catholic, I would have blown a gasket.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like you can imagine my reaction to that kind of garbage. I like whenever I see it, I jump on it on Twitter.
Well, I'm sure you feel the same way I do about like some of the Eastern stuff because it's like, no, you're ruining it. You don't
Yeah.
understand it. You're
Well,
just
that's what I
twisting
was
it
going
to
to
fit
get into.
yourself.
I think there's always going to be, a reactionary sort of sect of Christianities to sort of battle against the cat momism of Christendom. But, I think your ideology and like Eastern philosophy in general has been far more susceptible to this kind of thing because it's very decentralized. Like, other than the Dalai Lama, there's no big spiritual figure for this kind of thing. And
Oh, it
even when
is.
there is, sometimes you get a Pope Francis. So,
That's why I loved reading Julie Savola, because Eastern philosophy is definitely it's favored by the left, and not by the right. So I'm kind of alone that I'm this person who's right wing, who's always been right wing in some form or another, but really enjoys this like deconstructivist, uh, hippy dippy way
mhm.
of living and interpreting the world. So yeah, it definitely is susceptible to the awful things because a lot of it's like the intuitive, a lot of it's like I've said before, my favorite word, intuition, and feeling things out. That's sort of, you could view that as sort of like the more feminine uh part of metaphysics, right? Where the more masculine, if you want to break it down like that, and the yin and yang, feminine and masculine would be uh the German philosophers and the theologists, and just the more intuitive stuff, way of navigating the world has been, it's appealed to me more,
Yeah,
but also
no.
appeals to a lot of awful people
Mhm. Well,
that
I
I don't agree with otherwise.
sure, sure. Now, I would say, like I said, there's always going to be a reactionary contingent to Christianity, and it's sort of very easy to justify it. You're going to have to battle the people who try to jump through hoops to lie about it to some extent. But uh, hold on just a second. Where is it? But sorry about that. But yeah, it's easy to sort of battle the left wing of Christianity for the most part because there's sort of easy go-tos in the Bible and the Catechism and church tradition of it being a very anti-modernist, anti-modern left progressive type of thing, because that's what it's been throughout the majority of its history, and it's only this sort of recent co-opting. And you see factions within the left saying, Christianity can't be saved, or this religion can't be saved. We all have to be atheist, secularists, yada yada yada. But I feel like you know it's there isn't that same tradition for Buddhism or Hinduism to sort of go off of necessarily. Maybe it's just because I don't know the history and there is, and the cat moms don't know the history either. But there doesn't seem to be that sort of, inherently what we would consider today right wing tradition embedded in these theologies. So how do you make the case against, like I've heard cases made before, but I want to hear how you would make the case against sort of the left wing co opting Eastern philosophy in general.
I think the biggest point I would make is that they don't make any effort to understand it. They see a lot of surface level things about like, being compassionate, and, like I said, kind of a lot of like more feminine side of spirituality. Um, and they just see an image of it and then run with it, but they don't try to understand the complexities of it, which I'm definitely no expert in it by any means. But I make a strong effort to try and understand what these, thousands, and it's one of the oldest religions still being practiced today. Um, It's like 2,000 to 2,500 years old, thousands of years of writings and experiences.
Hmm.
Not all of them, and in fact, a lot of them don't fit into the modern left wing mold, but that's often just ignored.
Yeah.
And
Well,
you
it's
saw
interesting.
that kind of revolt in Japan and with the imperialists. I think that there was a lot of more traditional right wing style monks who, they liked monarchism and that sort of reactionary stuff,
Mhm.
and they kind of weaponized their ideology to do that.
Sure. And so I would definitely, yeah, again, like I don't know the history the best. One of the things I know, Owen Cyclops has sort of pointed out in the past, and you've disagreed with him somewhat on some of his takes regarding Buddhism. He was the one. Do you remember that thread a little bit, where he talked about like Buddhism is like nihilism for cat moms, essentially, something like that.
Oh man, yeah,
Yeah, well, he did have a good point in that when you talk about things like and he's not specifically Eastern, it's fair to say. He takes from a broad range of sort of mystic traditions, some of which being from the East, some being from like Arabic sort of alchemical leanings and things like that. But one of the things he talked about is like, how cat moms get into this, like, oh, the feminine energy of these planets or of this thing. And it's like how I got to absorb it and how we all need more of it. But it's like, oh, but gender is a total social construct and you got to let trans people live their lives. But yeah, these things are, exuding specific female and male energies. There's all sorts of stuff like that. I think he could probably find.
yeah, yeah. I'm looking at his tweets about Buddhism now. He has some interesting ideas about it.
Yeah, he's like, well, it's with him. It's not just Buddhism. It's also, again, he's just a mystic in general, I guess you could say.
Yeah, he
Uh,
goes in this tweet, dude. I've been fighting it so hard for so long, but I feel like there's nothing I can do about it. I truly feel like my soul has one foot in Buddhism and one foot in Christianity. And he goes, he can't shake certain aspects of Mahayana, which is the Zen. It's part of the Zen sect of Buddhism. I think that's interesting.
yeah, well, he's a cool dude, and if I ever got the chance, I'd love to talk to him someday, sort of about the same things. But then, what would your plan be? Obviously, you can't explain to every you know book club up and down the east and west coast that their interpretation of the writings of Buddhism and such are wrong. So what would you do to kind of or would you say, should there be a strategy to kind of retake Eastern philosophy, and if so, what would it be in your mind?
I don't think it's important to retake Eastern philosophy as
No,
like collectively. Here's why: because I think that spirituality is a individual thing for the most part. I mean, there's collective experiences that people have, and it's good to have like-minded people. But as long as you are doing it correctly and on the right path, and you have at least what is your best estimation of what the correct interpretations of some of these teachings are, that's what matters the most. And
sure,
I don't think there's, because it's easier to like retake Christianity or Catholicism because that's like an institution. And it's obviously it's more than an
yeah.
institution, but like you have that sort of like earthly basis for it.
Hmm.
Whereas
Buddhism just
and
doesn't
so
have that.
no, it doesn't. And Buddhism is a lot more interpretive. It's meant to be because a lot of they won't directly state things about metaphysics or reality. They'll gesture towards them in a
Hmm.
way, and you like meditate and you like, okay, like I think I get it, but you don't know, no. So that makes it much easier to twist to fit an ideology.
Sure.
Whereas, like you said, with Christianity, it's very easy to point in the Bible and say, no, it literally says the opposite of doing this. Like, don't it literally says you cannot do that and you have to act this way. Da 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 da. Da. It's a bit more straightforward to have that battle. So the battle for, I guess, Eastern ideals would be to just follow them to honestly to the best of your ability in your own life, because that's what they're for. It's individualistic in a way because it is decentralized,
Hmm.
and the
So
biggest. Go ahead.
sorry. It's just it's just you have to live in accordance with the teachings as best you can, and live as and your political inclinations kind of come second, but
Yeah.
just live as best you can according to them, pretty much.
That's all anybody can do. And I don't call myself a Buddhist. because I don't fully buy into the religious institution of it. Because in Zen Buddhism specifically, the most important thing is you have to have a teacher.
Hmm.
But there's no way I can know and verify that this is someone who can I can put all my faith in it, because that's what you're supposed to fully give yourself over. So I'm a proponent of the Alan Watts idea that you can be your own teacher, your own guru, um, as long as you're honest with yourself, and you are aligning yourself with the right ideals and the right practices. I think you can make progress on that.
Okay. Well, you know what? I think that's probably a good place to just leave it off at. So,
Okay.
you know what? Thanks everybody who tuned in. Thanks everybody who is still listening. And yeah, hopefully I'll be back at it sometime. I have some articles lined up to just sort of read off and respond to briefly, including not well, one article and a section of one video from Crown T's latest video where he name drops Hegel without understanding him at all, and my blood was a boiling. So I'll probably get into that at some point. But yeah, until then, thanks for listening, and so long, everybody.